this is medievalist.net, and I'm here with Professor John France from the University of Swansea. And Professor, we're here at the International Congress on Medieval Studies, and I just wanted to give a paper earlier today. Could you just tell us a bit about it?
Well, the substance of the paper is this, that crusading and crusaders have had a bad press. And people think that crusading is kind of total war, that it's nothing except massacres and blood. And in fact, what I'm arguing is that the people who went on crusade were going there for their spiritual benefit, and they didn't have a warrant to massacre people indiscriminately. And even if they wanted to massacre people, it was very difficult to do so in practice. So although there are occasions when things get out of hand, by and large what you see in the crusading period is both sides, both the Turks and the Crusaders, broadly accepting the rules of war. Warfare is much more frequent, it's much more intense, its consequences are much harsher than in the West. The terms, for example, for a surrendered town will be very brutal by Western standards. But nonetheless, towns are allowed to surrender. People are allowed to be ransomed if they're captured. And this reflects the general practice of the laws of war across the whole Mediterranean and across all its civilizations.
I was just thinking that everyone kind of thinks of this first siege of Jerusalem and how that ended up, but that's really kind of a different case from what normally happened.
It's an extreme case. The Crusaders were obviously very fired up after 3 years. They were very fired up. It is an extreme case, but it is an extreme case looked at the other way, and that is that it was a city which held out. Now, if a city held out and was stormed, the force getting into it has suffered terrible losses. Crusaders lost 25% of their strength in the siege. They're going to break in, their bloodlust is up, and the defense atomizes, it becomes individual. So do the attackers. And what follows in the city streets is likely to be a massacre. And people will make decisions about whether they will accept surrenders, on an individual basis. But even so, even in those conditions, many Muslims got away. They founded an entire suburb of Damascus. And they took with them, interestingly, the Quran of Uthman, which is a very big book indeed. Many of the Jews were killed, but again, many of them survived, because we have letters from the synagogue in Cairo arranging ransoms. So this wasn't a total, massacre. It was a classic example of what happens when you storm a town. There's a pretty nasty business. But it's a pretty nasty business whether it's in China, whether it's in Mongolia, whether it's in Iran, whether it's in Europe. That's exactly what happens.
The Crusades itself is it has very much popularity, like in the mainstream culture, casual historians, things like that. But even in the academic world here at the Congress, there's a lot of papers that deal with the Crusades. There's a journal that's just devoted to the Crusades. Several publishers have series they sell. Why do you think it still maintains, in an academic world, it still has a very strong popularity?
It has a very strong popularity in the academic world because it is very central to the medieval experience. The Crusade is invented by the papacy, and it becomes the great instrument of papal expansionism. It's the way in which the papacy, in a certain sense, controls Europe by controlling the Crusade, by creating this incredible ideal. And in that way, the Crusade is intimately tied in to all great developments in European history. So it's bound to be interesting to academics. And of course, we now have a situation where, Dan Brown and other popular stuff have also brought the idea of the Crusade to undergraduates. So American, British, Canadian undergraduates coming into universities are kind of fired up to wonder, who are the Templars?
Yeah.
So we've got another range of interest, and that is a teaching interest. So the Crusades is, in a certain sense, quite big business.
Just changing a bit, you're just finishing up a book called Perilous Glory, which looks at more of Western warfare, like a longer period, not just medieval. And I was wondering, coming from a medieval background, how was it? Was there a change in differences in writing a work that kind of has a more broad perspective?
Oh, I mean, it is much more difficult to get that broad perspective, and you have to learn so much as you go along. But I mean, what's very interesting is that, I mean, my argument, one of the elements of the argument is that you can't talk about Western warfare until you get to the Middle Ages, because there was no Europe. Europe in the classical usage is a quite different concept from the Europe that we know. And central to my argument is the notion that Western warfare develops in the Middle Ages, that it is a medieval phenomenon, which of course then goes on to change as technology, as wealth changes in the modern period.
Finally, getting back to Crusades, you offer a course at the University of Swansea. It's called Be a Crusader, and it talks. I was just wondering, how is that taught, and what is unique about that course?
It's a very specialist course. It's a third-year course for students who've become interested in medieval history, and it's focused on a single text, a single account of the First Crusade, where they really take the account apart. They really sort of read it closely, week by week by week, and we sort of discuss what every word means and what its significance is. And, you know, they really get into that. And of course there are some comparative sources as well with it. And the big question is, what sort of person do you think wrote this book, this anonymous account of the First Crusade, obviously by an eyewitness? Right, you know, when they get to look at the text that closely, they realise you can't make sweeping general statements. You've got to really argue about it and think about it.
I like the fact that you're looking at one particular text for a course and really trying to focus on that. Is that something you'd like to do? Or?
Yes, it's something I do like to do, because in general terms, students are given snippets from courses, from sources, generally speaking. By the time they're in their third year, they ought to be looking at something that is something holistically. They ought to be looking at the whole thing, and not just the bits that I've chosen for them. They ought to be able to choose what's significant themselves. And that's a step up from anything they've done before. And that's the interest of the course, I think. And it's very popular. It's always fun.
Well, thank you very much for talking with us.
Thank you.